It's time to refresh your yard during spring backyard days at the Home Depot. Get low prices guaranteed on propane grills starting at $179, like the Next Grill 3-burner gas grill. Or get $50 off the select Weber Spirit Grill and bring big flavor to your backyard. Then set the scene with Hampton Bay string lights that bring it all together. Shop spring backyard days for 7 days at the Home Depot, now through May 6th. Exclusions apply. See homedepot.com/price match for details.
Ready to soundtrack your summer? With Red Bull Summer All Day Play, you choose a playlist that fits your summer vibe the best. Are you a festival fanatic, a deep-end DJ, a road dog, or a trail mixer? Just add a song to your chosen playlist and put your summer on track. Red Bull Summer All Day Play. Red Bull gives you wings. Visit redbull.com/brightsummer ahead to learn more. See you this summer.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
What's going on, guys? This is Andrew Davis of Them Dirty Roses. You are listening to Jay Scott and the Hook Rocks Podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Hook Rocks, the ultimate rock community podcast. I'm your host, Jay Scott. Thanks again for tuning in. We are part of the Pantheon Podcast Network, great platform of music-related podcasts. There's something for everyone on the platform. You've got Martin Popoff, the rock historian, Vinny Appice and Carmen Apice with local Chicago promoter Ron Anesti and the Hangin' and Bangin' podcast, as well as Shout Out Loudcast with Tom and Zeus, Mistress Carrie out in Boston, and Cobras and Fire with Baco, who has a great podcast, kind of mixes comedy in with rock and roll. So check them out on Pantheon Pods on Facebook and Twitter, and also visit them at pantheonpodcast.com on the internet. You can follow us on Twitter, follow us on every streaming platform where you do get your podcast, and also look us up on Facebook too with the Hook Rocks, and set your app on your phone to automatic download. So every time the new episode airs, it goes right to your phone. It helps you have a better day. It's clinically proven that the Hook Rocks takes stress out of your life. I'm completely joking. Probably adds more stress to your life. I know it does for me. But anyway, I'm really excited about my next two guests. I've got Darin and John from Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast. Wanted to do this not only because it's Black Sabbath. I want to do a legacy show about the band, but I also want to do something special for Halloween. So I figure, why not do a legacy show on Black Sabbath? So Darin, John, what's going on? How are you?
Doing really well. Thanks for having us, Jay.
Yeah, doing good. Thank you for having us on your show.
I really do appreciate you coming on. As I stated, we always start the same way every time we do a episode with first-time guests, and that is what we're all about. Like every great rock song has a hook that sucks you in. Every rock fan has a moment, whether it's a song, an album, a band, or performance that hooked you on rock and roll. What was it for you guys?
Well, up for me with Black Sabbath, it was the first time hearing Paranoid. Yeah, I remember hearing, and we've talked about it on the podcast. I remember hearing Paranoid probably around 1981, I guess, when Ozzy first came around on the Blizzard tour. Now, I was familiar with Black Sabbath because I bought Never Say Die when I was getting into things that weren't Kiss when I was a kid, and that was one of the bands that had just released an album along with Van Halen, the new Rush. So I would frequent a record store, and I saw the Black Sabbath Never Say Die poster, decided to give it a shot, bought it, took it home. Didn't blow me away. Fast forward a few years later, I was riding in the car. I heard an advertisement for the Blizzard of Oz tour at the Tower Theater here in Upper Darby, PA. And the first few seconds, maybe up to a minute of Paranoid just blew me away. I loved the vocals. I loved the tempo of the song, the riff. I had never heard anything like it, and it blew me away. So then from that point on, I was all about Ozzy, getting more into Black Sabbath, checking out the albums that I probably should have heard initially, but didn't, and then all the way up until here we are. Many years later, still loving Black Sabbath. But that was my moment, hearing Paranoid for the first time.
Yeah, for me, what hooked me into rock was I had been exposed to Kiss and some Ted Nugent and stuff like that. I had an uncle that was only 10 years older than me, and he was listening to like Kiss and Ted Nugent, and I kind of liked that stuff. But when I heard AC/DC, I saw a video for them for You Shook Me All Night Long. This would have been 1980, Back in Black. It just came out. I was hooked. That's what got me into rock and roll. That's what ignited the flame for me. And it was right around that same time that our local classic rock station where I lived in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, Rock 107, shout out, used to play rock blocks. And they would play Black Sabbath, where they would play 3 songs from an artist, and they would play like Iron Man, Paranoid. And I heard that, and I just loved it. There was a kid on my bus who had an older brother who had the record, and he either took it when his brother wasn't looking or somehow convinced his older brother to let me borrow this Paranoid album. And I brought it home and made a cassette copy of it. And that was it for me. So the first band to get me into rock and roll was AC/DC with the Back in Black album. And what got me into Black Sabbath was the Paranoid album and, War Pigs, Paranoid, Iron Man, those songs.
As you guys listened to Sabbath and got into Sabbath, was there ever a moment where you kind of went away from them for a bit? Because, through everyone's musical journey, you always have your beginning. You have stages of different types of music that you enjoy and listen to. And then for whatever reason, you come back to where it all started. For me, it was Van Halen, Kiss, Journey, and then I've gone in and listened to other things, but I've always come back to like that stuff that made such a mark on my life as a kid. Was there anything like that for you guys?
Well, I mean, when I was a teenager, I started listening to, I think once I got into hard rock, I wanted to hear things. I wanted to keep moving up the ladder of heavy music. I wanted to go to the next level. And I remember when I was probably around 12 or 13, I saw a Motorhead album in the record store. And, I turned it over. I looked at the album cover. I turned it over and I said, and I just thought to myself, I'm not ready for this. This is probably way too heavy for me. But someday Someday I'll work up to that. A few years later, lo and behold, I was all about Motorhead and then Slayer, Metallica, and it was constantly about moving on and then getting into hardcore punk, anything that was heavy, anything that was aggressive. But then I started to see a lot of bands that were in that genre, of that ilk, paying homage to Black Sabbath. And I'd never really gotten away from Black Sabbath, but I guess I kind of like sidelined it a little bit. I was so into Black Sabbath when I was a kid. I mean, I listened to every album backwards and forwards. And, during that period of discovery, I was really occupied with checking out new stuff. But then when I started seeing pictures of bands or reading interviews of bands that were current and talking about how important Black Sabbath was to their formation, it kind of reminded me, oh yeah, Volume 4 was an amazing album, or Paranoid. Wow, I haven't listened to that in a while. And then started getting back into it. And it just became, I guess, part of the fabric of my day-to-day listening. And Ozzy too, Blizzard of Oz, Diary of a Madman, two heavy hitters there. But Black Sabbath, as I got older, I think when I was younger, I could interpret or I could connect with the music to a degree. But the cool thing about Black Sabbath is it speaks to a teenager as much as it speaks to an adult in some of the situations, some of the emotion that's conveyed within the lyrics, the melodies, the way the music sounds. It's one of the rare bands, I think, that, at least in my experience, that I could say that it's almost impossible to grow out of, because there's always something there to connect with. When I first started listening to Black Sabbath, I could connect to songs like Iron Man or Fairies Wear Boots, or something that didn't have quite as much of a, emotional, that wasn't really on as much of an emotional level. And then when I got a little older and you start to listen to some of the lyrics and the songs like Wheels of Confusion or Hand of Doom, or something that brings in more of an emotional vibe, it really resonates pretty well. So, I guess the thing is that, yeah, you kind of strayed away from it a little bit, always sort of had them on the back burner, but again, they just never went away. For me, anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. I drifted away from metal around 89, but I never really drifted away from Black Sabbath. At 88, 89, a lot of the bands that I was into were putting out albums that I didn't really care for. Think about what Priest it was putting out in 88, 89. Maiden was starting to feel a little bit stale to me. Also, at that time, I went to college. I was a music major in college. I had to listen to like a lot of classical and jazz stuff for assignments and things like that. So I sort of drifted away from metal, but I always stayed in touch with Black Sabbath. Now, this is the days before the internet. So it's kind of funny how things would I'd walk into a store. I remember Headless Cross, walking in and like, oh, here's a new Black Sabbath album, Headless Cross. I still bought every Black Sabbath album when they came out. I remember my wife, she wasn't my wife at the time. My girlfriend at the time worked at the radio station at our college. And she was like, hey, we just got this promotional copy of the new Black Sabbath album, Tear. That's how I heard that for the first time. And Black Sabbath was that one band, the only band that I can really say that I didn't drift away from. I drifted away from all my other mainstays, Maiden, Priest, Dio, Ozzy, AC/DC, those were my core bands. I drifted away from all of them, where I sort of lost touch with them, wasn't as interested in what they were doing. But Black Sabbath, I was still interested. Maybe the fire wasn't there as much as when I was 12 years old getting Sabotage for the first time. But if I saw a Sabbath album, I got it. I listened to it. I think like Darin said, Darin made a good point. I had gotten sort of burnt out on, hair metal was running its course in the late 80s. Bands like Priest were putting out things like Parental Guidance, and I just couldn't it just didn't translate for me. But Black Sabbath, at all phases of my life, Black Sabbath worked for me. It translated to me, and like Darin said, maybe what I thought when I was 12 years old, listening to it, it changed as I got older. But Black Sabbath is a band that's always been there for me.
My first experience with Sabbath was the Mob Rules. I was about 6 or 7 years old, and we had some older kids in the neighborhood. My brother was very influential in what I listened to, and we were at some house in the summertime, and we were listening to some old Scorpions, and a kid came over with Mob Rules and put on the album. Never heard anything like that before. Up until then, I'd heard some Priest, like Diamonds and Rust, Green Menalishi. I was familiar with Maiden, more so because of Eddie, and being 6 and 7 years old, having that, the impression of that was so, it had such a big impact on me. And then, of course, there was Kiss, and then there was, I think I mentioned Van Halen and AC/DC and some other bands. But when I heard Mob Rules, it was like, what is this? And then going backwards, I heard Iron Man, and of course, being a young kid and hearing Iron Man, it was the coolest thing ever. And then my first album I ever bought was Headless Cross. My first Black Sabbath album I ever bought was Headless Cross. And, it was just a band that obviously, I missed the peak of their prime. And, you had to appreciate, similar to like Led Zeppelin, you had to appreciate what came before you started listening. But the band was always present. And like you said, they were always so influential to the other bands I was listening, whether it was Metallica or whether it was, Anthrax and all these bands. And I, after being a Kiss fan when I was in grade school and going into high school, I became a Zeppelin fan. And once I got into Zeppelin, it's almost like simultaneously I got into Sabbath, because everybody talked about those were the two that influenced everybody in hard rock and heavy metal. And, I've always looked at those two bands, and this has been said before, it's nothing different, as basically the forefathers. You could probably put Deep Purple in there too, as well. Maybe some UFO too, and, some early Scorpions, but, those were the two bands. And I've always wondered, one of the questions I've always had is, obviously, Zeppelin has so many diverse styles, from album to album and even in the album, but, I understand why Sabbath influenced heavy metal, but I also think Zeppelin too had equal influence in terms of just arrangements. Because when you look at their styles, like with War Pigs or, with kind of Black Dog, it's still got that blues background in it. And it's just a different way of playing it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the difference was that, barring maybe some instrumental interludes and things like that, Black Sabbath was consistently heavy, at least for the better part of the 70s. For the better part of the 70s, or pretty much, Zeppelin was only around in the 70s. 79, I think, was when Enter the Outdoor came out, and it was essentially it for that. There was a lot of different things going on. There was traditional blues with Led Zeppelin. There was a lot of more folkish type stuff. Of course, we had Sandy Denny on Battle of Evermore. Yep. Sabbath never had songs like that, nor do I think it was really their intention. In the background, the members of Led Zeppelin was a little bit more diversified as well. We had Jimmy Page was in the Yardbirds, pretty much of a strictly blues rock band. They were also a little older, I think, and had more experience with traditional blues, early rock and roll. Black Sabbath just came out and hit hard, hit heavy, and that was basically their manifesto, was to just be loud, aggressive, full of emotion. And that was pretty much, they stayed on course pretty much throughout. I mean, there was some slight variation, but not nearly as much as there was with Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin, you definitely, like you said, Black Dog, real heavy song. I remember the first time I heard that, I was like, wow. Hold On Love, another one that's really heavy. When the Levee Breaks. But then you had some atmospheric stuff like, Kashmir, Stairway to Heaven, certainly. I mean, who didn't hear Stairway to Heaven, all the time? I don't think, and I'm not saying one's better than the other, because for me, I was more into Black Sabbath than I was Led Zeppelin. I mean, I also had my Led Zeppelin when I was into Led Zeppelin, and listened to a lot of Led Zeppelin until I got burned out on Led Zeppelin. But Black Sabbath just kind of resonated a little bit more for me. And I think I could just connect with it. I just felt like there was more of an emotional content with Black Sabbath. And I think that there was so much less pretense with Black Sabbath. I didn't feel like, I felt in a lot of ways, and not just Led Zeppelin, but with other bands as well, that there was there was a division there. They were the rock stars and you were the fan. Whereas with Black Sabbath, I kind of felt like, hey, we're kind of the same, because, some of the topics, lyrical topics they were grappling with, I could kind of feel too. And I could connect with that. And it wasn't really a whole lot that I could connect with lyrically with Led Zeppelin. I mean, the Lemon Song? No, not really. I mean, it was cool, but but like, oh man, so many different songs, Black Sabbath. Like I said, Wheels of Confusion, Under the Sun, just so many things that you could just kind of sink your teeth into a little bit more and relate to. That was the thing with me in Black Sabbath. I could just relate more to what they had to say. Whereas Led Zeppelin were sort of like kind of on a plateau that was a little bit above me, Yeah,
the difference for me between Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, they both come from the same place, which is the blues. And they roughly came up around the same time. Led Zeppelin, of course, released their first album a year or two before. Led Zeppelin released their first album a year or two before Black Sabbath. But what Black Sabbath does, and for me, this is what differentiates them and makes them, in my opinion, the creators, the godfathers of heavy metal. They had a mood, an atmosphere, a tone, a vibe to their sound that, although Led Zeppelin flirted with it at times, maybe in a song like No Quarter, maybe a little bit in Kashmir, maybe a little bit with the, what's going on with the album cover on Led Zeppelin 4. But Black Sabbath, the song Black Sabbath, the song NIB, the Hand of Doom, Children of the Grave, Under the Sun, Symptom of the Universe. These are all like just really intense. There's a dark overtone to these songs. And even though they're both coming from the blues, Led Zeppelin interpreted the blues in a way of like Communication Breakdown, which is a pretty heavy song. And it's got a real sort of metal trope to it there, the chugging on the bottom string and everything. But then Black Sabbath did the same thing with Paranoid. Those two songs are kind of similar. They have that chugging open thing. But Paranoid is just, the lyrics are darker and more like, what's going on here? It's just more ominous sounding. Ozzy, he's got a clean, high voice, not as high as Robert Plant, but but Ozzy's voice is more, has more of a creepy tone to it. And just to me, that's what separates Black Sabbath from, when people are citing who are the founders of heavy metal. You always hear Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, Black Sabbath. And for me, what separates Sabbath is that intensity, that emotion, that dark mood, this somber, the rain at the beginning of the song Black Sabbath, the subject matter, the album covers like the first album or Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. There are other bands that maybe briefly touched on that, but Black Sabbath, that was their calling card, and they did it really, really well.
I've always thought that heavy metal ran through the tone of Tony Iommi's guitar and the drumming of John Bonham. You know, if you look at those two and how they really were different than what was coming out. I mean, Page, of course, was this great guitar player, but Page, you know, was a blues guitar player, and he did some innovative stuff, but really the innovation was with Iommi and his tone, and you know how he played and how he presented the notes and how he attacked the notes. And then there was Bonham that played like no one else played before. So I always felt if you really want to break it down and kind of peel the orange back and keep peeling it back, I think those two were monumental in the sound and tone that what came after in terms of heavy metal. As far as Ozzy's voice, I've always felt that he doesn't get enough credit for the vulnerability in his tone of his voice. You know, it is a higher pitched voice, but it is of like that sad clown. You know, like when if the sad clown had a voice and was crying, like you see the pictures of the artistic portraits of the tearful clown or whatever, the clown with a sad face, it would sound like Ozzy if it sang. You know, there's a lot of pain and a lot of vulnerability in that voice, and it's so unique because no one sings like that. No one's ever been able to sing like that. And also, too, you know, they were very socially conscious coming out of the 60s, you know, which was the counterculture movement. You know, we talked about the lyrics with Zeppelin. It was, you know, Lemon Song, like we talked about, and, you know, the blues bass and the sexual innuendos. And some of the stuff probably wasn't as deep as the Sabbath stuff. I mean, you talk about, War Pigs being a, anti-war song. Zeppelin never did anything like that. And I think they really connected with that. They kept connecting with that counterculture movement, which is the seed of heavy metal when you break it down.
Yeah, totally. That makes total sense. The Sabbath lyrics, that's a very good point, that they were dealing with things like destruction of the environment with Electric Funeral or Children of the Grave, just other heavy subject matters, heroin addiction, Hand of Doom. And Zeppelin never really kind of went there. Nobody really went there back at that time. It was really Sabbath. And I love the way you describe Ozzy's voice because, he does bring that element of that's this mournful, wailing, sad. So when he's singing, children of today will be the children of the grave, the way he sings that, it's in like a mournful kind of, this is tragic. With the way he sings the War Pigs, the way these things are being done to people, it's tragedy. It's tragic.
I liked when you said that there was a vulnerability in his voice. I think that was a great way to describe it. And I think because of that vulnerability, it was easier for me personally to connect to it because I felt like, well, I liked the sound of his voice, but the vulnerability made it sound more sincere. Whereas if we're comparing Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, when you're listening to a Robert Plant, a lot of it was a lot of bravado, a lot of like vocal acrobatics, and with Ian Gillan as well. I mean, a lot of screams. Now, there was a lot of emotion that Ian Gillan would convey from time to time, especially in, Child in Time, with the screams. And that was also a socially conscious topic. Vietnam War. But by and large, those singers like Ian Gillan, Robert Plant, David Byron, we mentioned Uriah Heep, the emotional depth was something that was kind of far and few between. With Ozzy, it was kind of constantly there. And even though he didn't write the lyrics, and John and I have talked about this, if there were lyrics that he connected with, he could really sell them. She's Gone from Technical Ecstasy was a real melancholy ballad. And he didn't write the lyrics. It was written by Geezer, I believe. Geezer wrote most of the lyrics. But just the way that he took them and sang them with total conviction. And I think it was because of that vulnerable aspect that you described that made it really convincing. And that really worked to his advantage. Some could see it as a flaw, but I think with Ozzy, it was a plus. I mean, I think that it helped people really internalize, I think, a lot of the lyrics and a lot of the way that the vocals sounded. I think it did help to diminish some of the distance between artist and fan, and I think that can be important. I think in some respects, it's good to have that professionalism, that master class, very proficient on your instrument, or whether it be the voice or guitar or drums, whatever. But other times, I think from an artistic standpoint, it might be more important to connect with the audience. And I think that vulnerability was one way that I think that opened that avenue up with Black Sabbath, as far as Ozzy's vocals.
Yeah, and Black Sabbath for me always came across as like the working man's band. It reminds me a little bit of maybe like AC/DC, somebody like Bon Scott. Ozzy is sort of like that kind of character. He seems very real. He seems vulnerable. Like you mentioned, for me, he's kind of like the Rocky Balboa of heavy metal. He's this underdog guy that you want. He's flawed. But you want to root for him. You just like the guy. He's the type of guy that if you were in a bar full of people, you want to talk to the guy. You want to be friends with him. He just has this sort of vulnerable quality to him that he's still, even though he's, a mega billionaire today, he still has this. I mean, he's an ordinary man is the title of his most recent record, and I think that the difference between the Ozzy era and the Dio era, I mean, there were a bunch of differences, but one of them is that dynamic sort of changed. Ozzy was this fragile, vulnerable guy, whereas Ronnie was this powerful, larger than life. His lyrics were more fantasy based, more strength and power and holy diver. I mean, that's a Dio solo song, but you know what I mean? Just sort of more epic and powerful. Whereas, Ozzy, the Ozzy era of the band was this a little bit more of working class. We're just like you guys here. We're concerned about all this crazy stuff that's going on in the world also. And they always tell the story. Sabbath always says, we couldn't sing about, putting flowers in people's hair because we were in Birmingham where all the buildings were bombed out from the war. And, our streets were a mess and violence and gangs and stuff. So we couldn't relate to San Francisco and let's put flowers in our hair. They sang about what they knew about, which was destruction and decay and drug addiction and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I always felt too that what made Ozzy so endearing was he knew his limitations, right? He never tried to be something he wasn't. He never tried to oversing. Whereas much as I love Robert Plant, there's moments on every Led Zeppelin record where it's like, if he maybe did it a little bit more subtle, it may have had a more of an impact on the song. And I think Ozzy never, did that. I think Ozzy always remained in the song, remained very centered in what he was trying to do with his voice. And he knew he had that morning type voice where you think of, when you hear his voice and sing, you think of sadness, you think of, pain. And it's like that artist who paints on a canvas, who gets that muse, that motivation to feel something and put it on a painting. That's essentially what Ozzy is.
Yeah. And I think there's also probably with Ozzy, I think he put a higher priority on melody than maybe Robert Plant did. I think Robert Plant was obviously very conscious of melody, but I think he was also dividing his time between creating a memorable melody and also showing off what he could do with his voice and reaching for things and being flamboyant. Whereas Ozzy was more or less just trying to convey the melody. And like you said, I mean, he never outstepped his bounds. He never went beyond what we could all assume was his comfort zone. There's definitely times when, especially on Sabotage, which is an album that, the back history was that they were struggling with lawsuits and management and bad business and things like that. And it was really frustrating, and it got them to a point where they were very angry. So some of that material, you could hear Ozzy's voice straining, almost cracking at times, but it was more from an emotional standpoint. It wasn't like from a pretentious, I'm trying to do something that a better singer could do, but I can't. It was more of an emotional thing, which again comes back to what you said about his vulnerability. he kind of put his ability aside in order to convey the emotional content of what was in the lyrics. I think that's really important. And that's one of the things that makes that album so outstanding. I guess at some point, when you're talking about Black Sabbath and any other band, whether, the bands we've mentioned so far, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, keep coming back to the fact that if Black Sabbath there's like basically two distinct eras. And as John said, when the Dio era took off, then it became a different animal. And some of that, all these great qualities and these unique things that we've been talking about with the Ozzy era completely diminished. And it turned into something that was, like John described, when Dio came in with the fantasy lyrics and more of the, I guess you could say a little bit more pretense. And it definitely, it turned a corner. And I love it. I love the Dio era. I think for what it is, it was great. There was nothing else really. I mean, I guess you could say Rainbow, because Dio sang in Rainbow. But when you combine Dio's voice, and Dio adapted his voice to Tony's guitar playing. Tony was a heavier sounding guitar player than Ritchie Blackmore. And so Dio modified his voice to couple that. And the end result was this new era, this new sound of Black Sabbath. So, I mean, there again, they went from a band that was sort of in a class by themselves for the reasons that we talked about, vulnerability, the easiness to connect, the working man aspect. They changed gears and also became a unique band because they were probably like the darkest band, the heaviest band of the 80s at that particular point in time. Judas Priest was heavy. There was up and coming bands from the new wave of British heavy metal movement. In England, we had Iron Maiden, we had Angel Witch, Raven, Venom, things like that. But Black Sabbath they were the quintessential heavy metal band. And they were unparalleled. I mean, I guess you could say that in a way, it's almost as though Tony Iommi never really had a focus as far as concept of the band. But his one focus seemed to be constantly getting that guitar tone heavier. I mean, because from album to album, it just seemed like he just kept climbing the ladder. Like, okay, that was pretty heavy, but let me see what I can do on this next album.
Right.
And, it was always amazing. The tones that would come out of that guitar. Again, just set them apart from everyone else, I think.
I also think too, when you mention the new wave of British heavy metal and you talk about Sabbath, you look at all those bands that came out. Sabbath was the direct influence of those bands. Like that was the first line of musicians that really connected with Zeppelin. I mean, you talk about Holocaust, you mentioned Angel Witch, there's Witchfind, and you said Raven, who's a great band, and even bands like Diamond Head. Tank was probably a little bit more punkish, a little bit more Motorheadish, but you just had, these bands that came out that were very primitive and very raw. The production on those albums were very poor when you look at them now. I have a bunch of them. I've spent nearly a fortune on collecting all that kind of stuff. But what I appreciate about those bands, and it goes back to Black Sabbath, is, when you look at the timeline of influence, Sabbath was what they were playing from, what they were feeding off of. And it just grew from there. Then it grew into the thrash movement that, all those bands inspired. And you talk to Metallica, they talk about the influence of Sabbath, of course, Slayer and Anthrax, like we mentioned already. But it just really began with that. And those bands were not far off from when Sabbath started, but they were all, English bands. And Sabbath had that impact. And I think, I wasn't there, I wasn't present, but Zeppelin seemed to be more of the popular band, the band that all the girls went to, and Sabbath was the band that everybody wanted to headbang to. and just let out all that, or, that aggressive emotion.
It's amazing when you think about the influence of Black Sabbath. You mentioned the new wave of British heavy metal, of course, the metal scene in general in the 80s. I mean, the whole stoner rock movement can be traced directly to, Master of Reality. Doom metal, the subgenre doom metal is directly linked to Black Sabbath. I mean, their influence is huge. And when you think about bands that had that much of an influence, I mean, I'd put Led Zeppelin in there. If you go before Zeppelin and Sabbath, the Beatles, really, like Black Sabbath for me is the Beatles of heavy metal, where you talk to anybody. Even the guys in Black Sabbath will say they were influenced by the Beatles. Anybody of that age that started playing in the late 60s was influenced by the Beatles. They saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, if you're, here. But Black Sabbath is the same way. It's like sometimes you hear people say, every riff can be traced back to Tony Iommi, and there's some truth to that, in a way. And they've, there's other bands that are very popular. Kiss is a very popular band, and Ace Frehley inspired a lot of guys to play guitar. But there aren't as many bands that say, yeah, musically, we're Kiss. We're trying to sound musically like Kiss, but there are just tons of bands that are out there buying orange amplifiers to sound like Iommi, that are, there's bands that have crafted their whole careers around Black Sabbath. Sleep, for instance. Sleep or Electric Wizard. There's these bands that have just basically said, all right, we're taking this aspect of Black Sabbath, and we're making a career out of it. And Sabbath has become, I was just listening to the latest Sleep album today, and they have a song on there called Giza Butler. It's like Sabbath has become this thing. And we were mentioning earlier about, drifting away from metal and everything, and drifting away from Sabbath. But if you remember, like right around, I guess it was like 94, when that Nativity in Black tribute album came out. Tribute albums were sort of a new-ish thing around that time. And it became this thing where all of a sudden, all these bands, you really started to see the influence of Black Sabbath, all the modern bands like Typo Negative, down to, Rob Halford sang a song on that Nativity in Black. Their influence is just, it's huge. And I can't think of many other metal bands, maybe besides Led Zeppelin, that had as much of a influence as Black Sabbath has, especially on heavy metal. To me, they're ground zero. You can 5 degrees of separation. Every riff can get traced back to Black Sabbath in some way. It's their influence is huge.
It is a bit of a phenomenon when you consider that when you mentioned Sleep and they had a song on their new album, Giza, like the temple or the temples of Giza, Butler. It's like, it's unapologetic. It's almost like it's a standard, and we can take from this because it's such a enormous thing that, of course, why wouldn't we be able to? Black Sabbath is it's the all-encompassing element of everything that's around us when we play heavy metal. How could we not address it? But the thing that, when I said phenomenon, is that there's so many bands that, especially in the stoner doom genre, that purposely try to sound like Black Sabbath. You could even go back even further than that and say that Witchfinder General sounded like Black Sabbath, unapologetically. They just did it, and then it stopped for a little while, and then with the advent of stoner rock, doom metal, it came back full force. You have bands like Orchid, who it was like a costume party, and it was a tribute band. They dressed up like them. It was like, you looked at them on stage, and it's like, wow, man, looks like it's 1972, and the singer sounded like them. They had almost everything down to maybe exactly where the tattoos were placed. But it's like, what was it about Black Sabbath? This is a rhetorical question. What was it about Black Sabbath that makes bands think they can do that or want to do that. I mean, AC/DC was another band. John mentioned AC/DC early on when we started talking. They've got across the board have influenced a lot of different bands. The simplicity of the riffs, and it's nothing really. You don't have to be a virtuoso to play the songs, but just really, really catchy. But there's something about Black Sabbath, I think, that kind of just penetrated even deeper than that. It was beyond the workmanlike aspect of it. It was something that people just internalized and I think took possession of, because we invested so much into this music that it was like, it's okay to sound exactly like Ozzy. It's okay to rip off Bill Ward's drum fills. It's okay to take Black Sabbath riffs and make a song out of them, like Orchid did. I don't know why, but we felt, these bands obviously feel no compunction of guilt. I mean, it's just like, yeah, we can do this because we've invested so much of our time. We've invested so much emotion and ownership over these songs and over this band. It's a part of us, I guess. I can't think of any other reason anybody would have the audacity to rip off any band the way that other bands have ripped off Black Sabbath.
Well, their personality is so strong. They're so unique. They're like Jimi Hendrix or Eddie Van Halen. Nobody thinks now about if some guy's playing a whammy bar thing on his guitar. It's just become part of the vocabulary, if you will. And that's like Black Sabbath are like the building blocks. They are the vocabulary of heavy metal. So of course you almost have to draw from it. It's like Eddie Van Halen. I mean, his sound, the tapping, the technique, the whammy bar stuff, everybody does that now. That is just accepted as like, okay, this is, if you're going to be a rock guitar player, you have to have these tools in your vocabulary. And it's like with Black Sabbath, if you're going to be a heavy metal band, you've got to have these certain tools that were created, forged by Black Sabbath. They've got to be in your tool chest there somewhere. How you use them, that's up to you. But it comes, it's the same thing with Hendrix. Hendrix came out and everybody after that owes a debt to Jimi Hendrix in one way or another. And it's the same thing with Black Sabbath. They're so unique. They created this vocabulary that now everybody uses, to some bands, very much so, like we just mentioned. And then other bands just take little bits and pieces here and there from them. And they're a band that's respected across, like I think of when Guns N' Roses hit the scene, and they were very against a lot of the more glammy bands, but they were still, I would hear Axl Rose talk about Black Sabbath. Guns N' Roses used to do a cover of It's All Right live. Axl sat down at the piano on the Use Your Illusion tour, and they did a cover of It's All Right. But because it's Black Sabbath, it's cool. They transcended sort of time or genres or generations. They're timeless.
Yeah, and what else is pretty cool? You're talking about Guns N' Roses and a lot of mainstream hard rock bands in the 80s and even into the 90s that have taken Black Sabbath and made it such a prominent part of their, forte, or their whole basic musical message. Punk and hardcore was doing the same thing, which was initially punk started out as a reaction to like 70s rock, stuff like progressive rock. Punk rock was like the antidote. It was the antithesis of that 70s era bloated concept rock and all the dinosaurs that were associated with the 70s. Punk rock was like this new thing that was supposed to be less restrictive and more emotional, more reactionary. And yet here they are, Black Flag, Henry Rollins, a little later on, mid 80s, Corrosion of Conformity, hardcore punk bands with slow slower riffs, down-tuned Iommi-ish tones. Where did this come from? So it's amazing that, you have bands like, even though Axl was sort of, didn't really want to be a part of the glam scene, he was definitely a rock star. Henry Rollins was not. Guys in Black, the other guys in Black Flag were not. People in Corrosion of Conformity were not. So it wasn't that they could connect with the whole rock vibe of Black Sabbath's music. They dug a little deeper, I think, into that emotional aspect, pulled that out, made that a part of what they were doing. So I think that's pretty cool. I mean, you don't hear too many punk guys incorporating Uriah Heep, the Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, at least not intentionally, maybe accidentally. But the Black Sabbath influence, the Black Sabbath nod was definitely an intentional thing, and something that they thought was cool, and the kids thought it was cool too. And that, I think, for the next generation, I mean, there was obviously the Black Sabbath had a lot of fans in the 70s going into the 80s, but the kids that grew up where punk was their aggressive outlet, I think that some punk bands turned them on to Black Sabbath. I mean, Black Flag turned kids, teenagers onto Black Sabbath. They probably thought of Black Sabbath as Heaven and Hell or Mob Rules. They growing up in the 80s, being exposed to that hardcore punk music, thought Black Sabbath probably wasn't cool. But then here's, Black Flag playing recycled Black Sabbath riffs, and the kids being like, oh wow, what was the influence of that? Or reading an interview where they're paying homage and saying, yeah, Henry Rollins, like, unapologetically saying, well, I just love Black Sabbath, tuning Iommi, and the kids reading that being like, really, you mean Black Sabbath is cool? I thought they were a metal band. I thought metal was bad. Wait a minute, man, I have to rethink this. I have to rewire my brain and go back into this again. And it's pretty cool. Black Sabbath wasn't just a heavy metal band; they were just heavy music that that translated to rock, hard rock, heavy metal, and also punk and hardcore.
We talk about that vocabulary. We talk about the influence, and of course, it started with the new wave of British heavy metal and into thrash. And then you mentioned today, modern rock music, doom and stoner rock. I mean, I just had Lucifer on last week. A band from Sweden that has all the elements of Sabbath in there. And, it's a little more modern and everything, but man, right to the core, you hear it. You hear 1000 Mods from Greece, who's this great stoner rock band that just has this electric sound in what they do. And I remember hearing them for the first time like 4 years ago. I'm like, man, that is so Sabbathy. Like, wow, like young kids playing this music. And that really is, I think, the definition of their legacy. I mean, we could talk about the era after Ronnie James Dio where, it was the lead singer position was kind of a revolving door and constantly changing. But really, when you now take a step back and, we're in that reflective period of Black Sabbath where we're reflecting on their influence, that really is, I think, the definition of their legacy, which is all these genres of music that they touch, that they basically started. They're the seed of growth in all those genres.
Even grunge, the first wave of grunge. I remember when I heard the first wave of grunge, my first reaction was like, this is awesome. This is 70s Sabbath. When I heard Soundgarden, I thought Black Sabbath. Same thing with Alice in Chains and the Melvins. And, you're right. It's incredible how Black Sabbath, and even at that time, 90, Black Sabbath is, down and out a little bit in the early 90s, their late 80s, early 90s. I still love those albums, but, they weren't in the public eye anymore like they used to be, but yet their influence was still there. And I think that does speak to their legacy, the way that their influence has been able to stay alive and be handed down through so many different, if you got your heavy metal tree here and Black Sabbath is the base of the tree and you see all these branches shooting off from it.
It's funny because in the early 90s, right around the grunge time, heavy metal was like, it was just so not cool, and not to me, but in the mainstream, if you read Spin magazine, I mean, if you were like musically, you tried to stay musically on top of what was going on in the early to mid 90s, and you read magazines like Spin or whatever, there was definitely a backlash against heavy metal. Heavy metal just wasn't cool. It was just like grunge was trotted out, and it was basically heavy metal's replacement. And a lot of the bands were talking about making fun of bands. Nirvana was making fun of Guns N' Roses and things like that. So the basic sentiment was that heavy metal's just not cool, except for Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath is cool, but all other heavy metal is not. But Black Sabbath is. Well, what about Aerosmith? What about Led Zeppelin? What about no? Okay, but I don't understand. Black Sabbath was from that era. I can't explain it. They're just cool. Black Sabbath gets a pass. All heavy metal is bad. It's let's ridicule it. Let's make fun of it. Let's just tear it up in the press. But we can't touch Black Sabbath for whatever reason. It just had that effect. Or just couldn't be diminished, I guess.
When you think of Ozzy's solo career and you think of Jake E. Lee and you think of his band Badlands, with a very heavy Black Sabbath influence. When you think of that atmospheric style of guitar that he really played, that was a lot different than what he did with Ozzy, on Bark at the Moon and Ultimate Sin, where he really kind of went more towards a darker tone on that record. And of course, Ray Gillen, sang on a Black Sabbath album, so there was that connection there, even though Ozzy wasn't a part of that band. But when you think of that era in the late 80s and 90s, do you think because of the ins and outs of singers and all the issues they were having, do you think that may have hurt their legacy during that time? Whereas, other movements of rock were happening and Zeppelin was becoming more popular and during the time, because if you look at Zeppelin, of course, in the 70s were extremely popular, but they kept growing their popularity even after they weren't even making any new music. Whereas Sabbath, even though they were making music, they had that challenge of remaining relevant. And in many ways during that period, they kind of failed at that. Of course, the hardcore Sabbath fans, were listening to it. But, as I mentioned, we're in that reflective period. If you look back on their career, do you think that created a challenge of, defining their legacy as we look at them now?
I think they got back together with Ozzy enough times. Like, when did Live Aid happen? What was that? 85. Okay. So remember, they played at Live Aid with Ozzy. That sort of, brought back that. You were talking about Led Zeppelin. I agree with you. Like the Led Zeppelin, they became like this classic rock, legendary band that still seemed to never really go away. In some ways, they grew in stature. It seemed like through the 80s and to a certain degree the 90s. And I think Sabbath, I agree that I think a lot of people who are just casual rock fans aren't even aware of some of those Martin era albums. Fans like us, we were buying them, we were aware of them. But I think what did keep their legacy around was Dio came back for a brief spell. Ozzy, they did a one-off thing at Live Aid. They did the thing with Ozzy's No More tours where they were playing a set with Ozzy there. And then by the time the late 90s rolls around, Ozzy does eventually come back into the band, and they did do the reunion thing. But I know what you mean by the constant revolving door of singers. It did not help. In some ways, if the band had stopped right after Dio, it may have had a trajectory a little bit more like Led Zeppelin, like you described. But that constant revolving door of singers and musicians and everything, it really, it took them off the mainstream radar. But I think it was those getting back together with Ozzy on a somewhat, regular basis, even if it was just here and there, even if it was just rumors. And the other thing is that Ozzy was massively successful. This is another point when, you know, the mid 80s and on, Ozzy was huge until, you know, let's say No More Tears. Osmosis was a huge record too. You know, Ozzy was very mainstream, the Osbournes, the Ozfest, and all that time, Ozzy's name Black Sabbath gets tied in with the Ozzy name. So in some ways, maybe Ozzy's solo helped keep Black Sabbath alive, the name alive during some of those more down years for the band.
I think for me, and I like the album, 7 Star, but I think that's when people started to become a bit disenfranchised with what Black Sabbath was. It was really hard to figure out exactly what was going on there. The music just took a different turn. There was the singer, you know, Glenn Hughes. And I mean, Glenn Hughes was of course, you know, he was in Trapeze, but Trapeze is obscure by and large. He was in Deep Purple for a couple albums, 3 albums. So, I mean, he had that 70s heavy rock credibility, but still relatively speaking, he was kind of obscure. So when his voice came into the Black Sabbath or the Tony Iommi solo album, which was called Black Sabbath, I think it just sounded so different from anything else. It was really hard I think a lot of people just jumped off. They're just like, yep, I'm out. That's it for me. I don't know what's going on here. I can't figure it out. It's not bad. It's not bad, but it doesn't sound like, look, I hung with him through Dio. You know, I could get into that. It was cool. You know, I loved him in Ozzy and I loved him in Dio, but yeah, this is just too, I can't wrap my head around it. And I think people did kind of jump off. And then from that, then we had, you know, Ray Gillen was in for a period of time. He did some shows. I guess he recorded basic tracks for Eternal Idol, but then Tony Martin came in and recorded. Tony Martin is like, he's a great singer. And I think he really did the band a service in so far as being able to do every era he could do. He could sing the Ozzy material in a way that did it justice. Dio couldn't, not for him not being a good enough singer, but his voice was just different. And I don't think Dio wanted to do that. I don't think he wanted to sing like Ozzy. I don't think he wanted to sing that material. He could do the Dio era material really well. And of course, his own material that he was a part of within Black Sabbath was kind of a combination of the Dio and Ozzy era. You know, we kind of go back and forth with different moods and different vibe of some of the songs in the Tony Martin era. So I think in a lot of ways, the thing that really broke Sabbath down and was a fatal misstep was 7 Star. And I do like the album for what it is, but I think if I'm looking at it in retrospect and I'm thinking, where did things go too far off track? I think that was it. I think if they'd have gone from Dio and went right into Headless Cross, maybe it might not have been such a difficult transition for people to make, but I think the 7 Star just kind of tripped people up. Another observation, and we were talking about Live Aid, and the thing about, I was watching the movie, you guys have probably seen it too, the Bohemian Rhapsody, where they're talking about that Queen has the opportunity towards the end of the movie, and Brian May is convincing Freddie Mercury or vice versa. They're talking about, every band is getting together, and they list off every single band except for Black Sabbath. And that reunion was so significant because it was the first time that lineup had been on stage since 1978. And it was like, wait a minute, what just happened here? Did Black Sabbath just get snubbed? Yes. Why? Why did they get snubbed?
And they've always been, they never, for as much as we mentioned earlier that they're the working man's band, they never won over the musical elites, the critics, the people who hand out statues at awards ceremonies. You know, Sabbath, like, they were never that band, and I think that's what endears them to the fans. They're the fans' band. You know, if you're a Black Sabbath fan, you're a Black Sabbath fan and it means something really special to you. They've never had any, big, huge sellout moments. They never became something where there were, I don't know, variety cartoon TV shows on TV about them. Or, you can maybe say Ozzy with his solo career with the Osbournes. He became very commercial and mainstream, but Black Sabbath, they never did. They never won awards. They're never a red carpet. They're never a red carpet band. But what did do them a disservice to what we were saying here earlier is they never had the same lineup. After Never Say Die, every Black Sabbath album would have at least one different member in it. And on top of that, between every record, once you get around the Seven Star era, you would open up Hit Parader magazine and that issue, Ron Keel was the vocalist. Some other guy was playing bass. Some other guy was playing. By the next issue of Hit Parader, it was somebody else. It was somebody, and it was always the same thing. There'd be a band picture of them and the new lineup of Black Sabbath. And just when you were like, oh, cool, you get excited about it, it changed a month later. And it was really hard to get invested. I loved it, but what it did lose was that, through that whole era, it was so confusing, and it almost got to a point where you're like, yeah, right, new bass player. I'm a bass player, so this would always interest me. Like, okay, they've got a new bass player. Let's see if this guy can last till the next issue of Hit Parader. It was hard to get invested in it sometimes because it changed so often, and I think that really hurt them. This just constant revolving door of musicians.
I think that in spite of the fact that they were having a difficult time staying relevant, I think that their legacy was so huge, was so important that it saved them. It was the one thing that kept that ship sailing all the way through. I guess you could say until, when was it, 1998, 96, when they got back together with the original lineup for the Reunion Live album. Although Bill Ward didn't participate in the tour that followed, but there was a lot of excitement about that. People really were like, yeah, Black Sabbath, cool. And any of those albums that didn't really chart or weren't really a blip on the radar were pretty much forgotten about. And people were basically, I remember I was excited. John, you probably saw the shows too. 96. Did you go to Ozfest and see that? Yeah. Walking around, I had like money burning a hole in my pocket. I just went right to the merch. I bought every single T-shirt. And the funny thing about it was the main artwork was some of it from, the design from the Reunion album, but a lot of it had the pilots from Never Say Die. So it was almost subconsciously, the narrative was, we're picking up where we left off, and nothing that happened after that, before this, is even relevant. It doesn't exist. We're going back to Never Say Die, to right here in the present tense. And yeah, that made sense. You get the same lineup, and it worked because people are already sort of either didn't know about Headless Cross, Eternal Idol, Tear, Cross Purposes, and I really love those albums. I've grown more fond of them over time, but I had some problems, some issues connecting with some of those songs. Some of the. I could take a song here and there and be like, yeah, that's pretty cool. But overall, the album, did I internalize it as much as I did anything from the Ozzy or the Dio era? No way. And I think a lot of people probably felt the same way. So maybe they didn't hang with Black Sabbath the way that I tried to, like just held on for dear life. Like, come on, I have faith in you. You're not going to let me down again, are you? Oh, but I'm still. And then I got a treat. I got dehumanized, and I was like, yes, finally. I knew if I hung in there long enough, that my prayers would be answered. And it'd be a great Black Sabbath album. And then, that lasts about a year, and then boom.
And then Forbidden shows up.
Yeah. But I was cool with that because I'm like, I don't care. At least that kind of rejuvenated my, my interest again. It's like, okay, revitalized. I've had some Dehumanizer. Now I can take on Cross Purposes, and I think I can like it. Cross Purpose had come after Tear instead of Dehumanizer. I probably wouldn't have had much time for that, but anyway,
Michael Bolton auditioned for them before Dio. Is that true? I've heard that.
I heard it was after Dio. Yeah. Tony,
I've heard that. Yeah.
Tony's talked about it, and Michael Bolton's talked.
It seems like it's incredible the number of people that say that they had a cup of coffee with Black Sabbath, that they had an audition that lasted for one photo session and were gone before the film was even developed.
Yeah.
Dave Donato. The photo session.
I do remember that. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's incredible how many people walked through that band. Then when you get into bass players and keyboard players and different guys that just, had some sort of passing association with the band, it was really, just a real revolving door.
We had Terry Chimes on drums from The Clash. I mean, I never saw that.
Bevan from UFO toured with them. Not from UFO, from ELO.
ELO, but that wasn't quite as strange. At the time, it was like apples and oranges. But when you think about it, Jet Records, Don Arden, Bev Bevan grew up in the same area of Birmingham. They knew each other. It started to make sense. But Terry Chimes, wow, how did that happen? And I still don't know how that happened. And he sounded good with them. He was on the Eternal Idol tour. I think he was actually on part of the 7 Star. I think he was only with them for about a year or so. But some of the live shows, and I have a ton of bootlegs, and some of the live shows from the Eternal Idol tour are fantastic. And Terry Chimes, I mean, well, he sounds a lot better than Bev Bevan, that's for sure. I mean, he at least tried to do Bill Ward's fills, and for the most part, he was pretty successful, if not even incorporating his own. He was a good drummer. Bev Bevan, I don't know, maybe was. It's never really impressed me, but the Bev Bevan thing was kind of strange in a way.
As we close, what do you feel their definitive song and definitive album is? That defines their legacy, that defines who Black Sabbath is.
Diver Down.
It has to be Paranoid. I mean, that's their biggest selling album. That has all their iconic songs on it. Iron Man. If you can be watching a college football game and Iron Man comes blasting out over the PA system. I can hum the riff to Iron Man to my parents, and they won't know what the name of the song is, but they'll recognize it. And they don't know what album it's from, but everybody, whether you realize it or not, you've heard Iron Man or you've heard Paranoid. I mean, those songs have sort of, transcended time at this point. You hear them in TV commercials and stuff like that. And so I think it has to be, for me at least, Paranoid is the album that defined Black Sabbath.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Paranoid too. When John and I did our ranking, our Black Sabbath album ranking, all 19 albums, we started at the bottom, worked our way up to the top, and I put Paranoid at the top. I said, you really can't talk about Black Sabbath and not mention War Pigs, Iron Man, Paranoid, Fairies Wear Boots. I mean, every song it's iconic. It's probably the most important Black Sabbath albums. Is it my favorite? No, not necessarily, but I think it's the most important album. I think it's the album, if I ran into somebody who'd never heard of Black Sabbath and wanted to know what they sounded like, I would give them a copy of Paranoid and say, hey, take this home, listen to it, come back tomorrow and I'll give you another one. But this is where you start. I think it's the most important album.
And I think back to that 10-year-old me borrowing that record. I remember my first thought borrowing that record was, this is awesome. Now I can listen to Iron Man as many times as I want to. I don't have to wait for it to come on the radio.
Yeah.
Whereas now, many years later, I'm kind of like, I'm a little bit tired of Iron Man and Paranoid, but man, the the 10-year-old me, just when I had that record in my hand, that's all I kept thinking was, man, I can't wait to listen to Iron Man over and over again.
Are you guys like me where if you walk into a bar or club or tune in on the radio and you miss part of the intro of Iron Man where he goes, Ozzy does the thing, you're like, oh, damn, I missed it. It's like, I still feel that way even now that, I'm in my 40s, I still get upset whenever I miss that part of the song.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. I just noticed, and here's the great thing about Black Sabbath. How many times have I heard the song Iron Man? Thousands, tens of thousands of times. I was listening to it when we were getting ready for our podcast episode on the album. And I noticed it just for the first time. I noticed that bass drum in the beginning, the boom, boom, it moves from one speaker to another, like somebody walking, like an eye, boom, 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 moving across your thing. And I mean, of course I had heard that bass drum, but I had never noticed really that it moves from one speaker to the other. And it gives you this illusion of an Iron Man, an iron bloke, as Geezer likes to say, kind of walking around. And here it is like 10,000 listens later. I just noticed that.
That's one of the things that's so cool about, for people like us who've heard these albums so many times, thousands upon thousands of times, when we get these super deluxe box set editions and, they've been remastered or in some cases remixed. And it's so cool to listen to, well, especially with the Paranoid box, because that has a quadraphonic mix and you can hear some of the instruments are more obscured in favor of other things that are going on. It's really cool. It's almost like a reward for having listened to these albums for so many years, for so long, for so many times that it's like they've decided that the Sabbath gods have smiled upon us and said, okay, you're in for a treat. You're going to be hearing Volume 4, Paranoid, Sabotage, and Technical Ecstasy in a completely new and unique way. Ah, great. And it's exactly what they did. I mean, it's like, we love those albums, but yeah, we've heard them a lot. These super deluxe box sets, have really opened them up in a way that's made them like discovering them all over again. Still the songs that we know and love, but just like giving it a little bit of an extra dash of something, just making it a little bit more interesting after all these years, something different.
Here's that tambourine a little bit louder in War Pigs.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I mean, I agree with Paranoid on the album, but for me, the song that defines them is War Pigs, because I believe it really does show a diverse side of the band that I don't think that the casual Sabbath fan or casual metal fan really gives them that due, that how diverse they really were. And I think that song really does encapsulate like what they were socially conscious, atmospheric and heavy music. I mean, it really does, define them, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Darin, John, thanks for doing this, man. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do it again.
Thank you. Cool.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. That's Darin and John from Into the Void, the Black Sabbath podcast. I'm Jay Scott, listening to another edition of The Hook Rocks. Take care of each other. We'll talk soon. Thanks.
300 Favorite Albums with James Campion.
I don't think there's an album I know better front to back. I learned how to play guitar to a lot of these songs.
If I could pick one record to hand someone and say, this is what it feels like to be a woman, it would be this record.
You know, the engineer that was recording the album for us was a novice engineer. He was really the janitor.
The first half of these sessions for the album were totally improvisatory in the sense that they went into the studio and just dealt with whatever happened.
There was space that was left for these listeners to kind of discover it for themselves. That they would say, yeah, my parents listened to it, but I had to build my own relationship to it.
Happiness, good living, peace, love, rock and roll. I just feel like this album is such a wonderful translation of that concept.
People understood they were in a world historical moment, and it felt like it was going to last forever. In fact, the infinite spaces that they explored in The Giant Now is part of what made that explosion so huge.